What I'm supposed to do here is, within 20 minutes, to do something that has taken 25 centuries to develop in the Western world, and to compress that. I can also say it has taken me more than 40 years to put together something that I now feel confident in calling a theory of knowledge. And I have not done that by myself. I will only mention some of the contemporaries who have greatly helped and stimulated me in doing that. And all that started for me with Warren McCulloch. And then came Silvio Ceccato and Heinz von Förster and Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. And last, and certainly not least, Jean Piaget, whose work I have understood only very recently, and who I think is really the founder and father of modern constructivism. So I will try to compress that in 20 minutes, and the result of that will be that I will speak on 2 points in the theory of knowledge. And let me compress the history in a very subjective and idiosyncratic fashion. It all began with the pre-Socratics in the 6th century BC. The pre-Socratics were marvelous people. They were something like the people during the Renaissance in Italy. They were men who were interested in absolutely everything. They did biology, physiology, physics, astronomy, poetry, music, the rest, everything. And they also had what is usually not considered a technology, but I think it was a very sophisticated technology with somewhat other means than the means we use today. They were very good at solving practical problems. They dammed rivers, they carved marble, they cast bronze. They had all sorts of ways and means of dealing with their experience, solving problems, avoiding situations which they didn't like, and trying to foster situations which they did. It seems that it was in those days that they began to question what it was that you called knowledge. Having a great deal of experience in the problems of living, it was not at all surprising that they approached the question of knowledge in exactly the same way they would approach a practical problem. And you can read statements in them that say, some of them were later formalized by Socrates and Plato, but you can read statements where it says explicitly that you can only perceive something if there is something to perceive. Now that's a very reasonable statement. That is the kind of statement that any child today who grows up and gets to the age of about 12 or 13, if he's or she's precocious and begins to ask what is knowledge, that's how they will set about it. They will begin to think about the senses. And the senses become the means of communication with a reality that is not questioned at all, because in that reality you know how to move. You know how to manage your problems. You have learned a hell of a lot of tricks that allow you to deal with that reality. However, once you have set up that scenario of the cognitive human being coming into a world that is already fully structured and having the task of discovering what that world is like and gathering knowledge that is supposed to be in some sense a picture of that world, you have landed yourself with a paradox, and a very real paradox. And the paradox is simply that sooner or later, when you have done that, you will become curious of just how good that picture of the world that you've made for yourself is. How true is it? And what does true mean in that context? Unfortunately, in that context, true means like the real world. The more like your picture would be, the better it should be. And I'm sure once I have said that, you all realize that you can never find out that likeness. Because in order to do that, you would have to have not only the picture you have made, but also what it depicts. You would have to have access to what you have experienced and organized in your experience, as well as to what it was before you experienced it. And that, of course, is utterly impossible, because the only access you have to the world is, again, via your experience. Now, that's no news to you. Anyone who has read any one of the skeptics in the 2,500 years that have passed since then will know that very well. It has been the mainstay of the skeptics' argument. It has never been answered. The history of epistemology of the Western world is the history of more or less ingenious attempts to circumvent that impasse. It has been utterly unsuccessful. There have been some wonderful myths created about how it is that we come to know the world. Poetically beautiful, starting with Plato, who was a great poet, going to Leibniz, who was also a great poet in his notion of how you could solve that problem. But it hasn't been solved. If you look at the history of other sciences, you find that every now and then there's been a terrible obstacle. Things didn't work out. Things turned out to be impossible to do. Well, what happened then? You had a famous revolution in science. The revolution means that you changed your basic concepts. You started the whole game with a different conception of the situation. But science and the scientific knowledge does not proceed in a linear fashion. But it proceeds in one direction until it can't go any further. And then it goes back almost to the root, or to the root, and starts with different conceptual tools and does something else. Strangely enough, in epistemology, that hasn't happened. If you go to any course at a university today on epistemology, and you tape the discussion between the instructor and the graduate students, they're almost Platonic dialogues, except that often the instructor is not as good as Socrates was. The questions are the same, the tentative answers are the same, the way the answers are demolished are the same. So, what is there to be done? I think the only thing to do is to do what scientists in physics, in astronomy, in other fields have done all along. You see what was wrong at the beginning. And what was wrong at the beginning was the whole notion of what knowledge is supposed to be. You have to give up the notion that knowledge is in any sense a replication of the real world, is in any sense a picture, and worse than that, is in any sense corresponding with a reality. Because there is absolutely no reason, logically, to assume that. What do we ask of knowledge? We ask of knowledge that it allows us to organize our experience, not the real world, our experience of the real world in such a way that we can do some of the things that we would like to do and avoid some of the things that we don't want to do. This is blatant instrumentalism. And those of you who have any background in traditional philosophy will know that professional philosophers are rather scathing about instrumentalism. In recent years, the one, I think, who has written most intelligently about this was Karl Popper. He spent almost his entire life fighting for the maintenance of some kind of realism, metaphysical realism, actual realism, doesn't matter. At the same time, Karl Popper gave perhaps the best description of instrumentalism. And at the end of it, when he wants to demolish instrumentalism, what does he do? He says, well, as scientists, we simply ought to try and find out what the world is like. He gives a kind of prescription. He cannot produce any logical reason why one should do that. Now, how much time? I try to compress a little more. The question that arises, if you assume that attitude, and try to work with a new scenario where the cognitive organism is no longer obliged to find out what the world is like, but does nothing but organize his or her own experience. The question arises, well, is that solipsism? Does it really mean that the individual can do and think anything he likes and that becomes his or her world? We all know that that is nonsense. Berkeley, who in a way tried very hard to pursue that line and contributed, I think, very valuable insights to it, he also realized that that was not the solution. Why is it not a solution? Because we all know perfectly well that the world we find ourselves living in is in many ways not at all the world we would like to be living in. We constantly hit into obstacles when we want to do something, and the obstacles are terribly real. They are hard. So we know that there is a hard reality against which we bump all the time. So what is the answer to this? I think the answer is extraordinarily simple. That the knowledge we have is always knowing ways and means of how to move between the obstacles. And the difficulty, the conceptual difficulty in this, is that although we bump into the obstacles, if you accept that metaphor, we can never describe the obstacles. We don't know what they are. Because all we know that a certain line of action we have taken cannot go further. We are at the end of that action. And that, I think, is why we can describe the world only in terms of our own failed actions. The example has been given a long time ago, and I tried this morning to remember who it was, I couldn't, of a man walking, a blind man walking with a stick. It was Gregory Bateson, I think, who used that. Now, what happens inside the blind man with the stick? What information, if you want to use that awful word, does he get from the world? He gets nothing but the feeling of resistances. And out of that collection of points of resistance, he can construct for himself a map, if you like, of where he can walk through the room, how he can get to the front door. If he does it long enough, he can even get a map of the village or the town in which he lives. But that map is constituted by nothing but points where his stick did not go any further. That is why, and I think the English language gives you an enormous advantage here, because you have two words, and the words are match and fit. In the traditional theory of knowledge, knowledge was always supposed to be a match of the real world. It was supposed to depict it and to be correct in depicting it. Whereas what knowledge really does, it fits into the real world. It gives you ways of moving in the spaces that, if you will, are left free for your actions by the real world. Let me finish this by giving you a metaphor that struck me as being extremely useful in that context. Believing that knowledge is a picture of the world is rather like believing that when you run out of gas in your car, that is the end of the road.